I think I might have a problem. You see, I really like sugar. I participated in a donut run where you run several miles, eat a dozen donuts, and then run several miles back without hurling your guts into a bush. You know, the funny thing is, 2 hours later, I wanted more donuts. I've even eaten an entire family pack of Oreos because I didn't want it there tempting me anymore. Hi, my name is Christina and I'm a neuroscientist. And that's why in 2013, when the news came out that Oreos were as addictive as cocaine, at first I was a little worried. And then I dug deeper into the science behind the story. And it turns out that's not what it showed at all. The media got this one wrong. But before I go into the questionable power and addictiveness of Oreos, let's back up a second. What is addiction? Addiction is a disease of the brain. Addictive substances hijack our natural reward, learning, and decision-making systems until we can't help but seek out more and more of the thing that we're addicted to as our lives fall apart around us. Addiction is diagnosed using a manual called the DSM-5. It might be tempting to diagnose yourself with an addiction when you see the list of criteria. After all, a diagnosis of a mild substance use disorder only requires meeting 2 of these. Now let's be clear here. We talk very casually about being addicted to things that we like, but clinical addiction is very different. The craving that the symptoms talk about is talking about an obsessive, compulsive, all day, all-consuming thinking that's really messing with your daily life. For example, imagine that you're staying home eating Oreos so much and so often that you're about to lose your job. You're also not spending time with your friends and family like you used to. That's clinical addiction. We know that things like this happen when you're addicted to cocaine. The problem with the way this news spread was that it didn't match up with what the science actually showed. So how did the media get this wrong? In order to show you that, I'm going to have to take you down to the lab and show you what the researchers did using animals. There are many tests that scientists might use to figure out whether something is addictive. For most of these tests, they use rats. Rats and humans act pretty alike, but there's one caveat. Rats don't inject heroin into themselves or do cocaine in the wild. We can't use rats to model the human condition of addiction, but we can use them to figure out certain aspects of addiction. This box is called a conditioned place preference test. Conditioning is just another name for training. So like conditioned place preference implies, we're going to train a place preference. This is a test to see what rats like. They don't like it, they're not very likely to become addicted to it. In this test, scientists close the gates between rooms. Then they give the rat something they suspect the rat might like in one room, like Oreos, and then later, something they want to compare it to in the other, usually something kind of meh. The researchers in this study used rice cakes, but I couldn't find any, so here's a rock for illustrative purposes. The researchers then let the rats experience the 2 foods in each of the rooms a handful of times. After training, scientists raise the gates and let the rat pick which room it wants to spend time in. This allows you to make a comparison of Oreos and rice cakes. Which ones do rats prefer? It's like picking your favorite restaurant. When you've been to a place and had a good time, you're way more likely to go there in the future. So the rats liking what happened in one place versus the other means they spend most of their time in, you guessed it, the place where the Oreos were. It's a perfectly reasonable scientific study. This test is used all the time and has been for decades to study addiction. And we know that rats prefer the places where they get drugs, and they also prefer the places where they get Oreos. But they also prefer the places where they get crappy little food pellets. I mean, this test alone isn't enough to say that anything is addictive. We need further tests in order to make that conclusion. All this test says is that rats like Oreos. They didn't just test Oreos. They did also test cocaine versus saline, which is just a salt solution. They did the same sort of training, cocaine on one side and saline injections on the other. The key piece of evidence that had everyone saying Oreos are as addictive as cocaine was that in the 2 separate tests, rats spent the same amount of time on the cocaine paired side as they did with the Oreo side. But wait a minute. If one night your friends suggested that you guys hop back and forth between your second favorite bar and your number one favorite bar, let's say they're right next door to each other, you're gonna spend more time in your number one favorite bar. Let's say you hang out there for like 2 hours. Then the next night, you get to hop back and forth between your second favorite bar and your third favorite bar, oddly again, right next door to each other. And of course you spend more time in your second favorite bar, 2 hours there in fact. Now, does that mean that you like your first and second favorite bars the same? Of course not. What you want to do depends on the particular choice you are making. The study that all the news outlets went crazy for never actually gave the rats a choice between Oreos and cocaine. It just wasn't a direct comparison. And here's the kicker. Even if the researchers had tested directly whether rats preferred Oreos or cocaine, we're programmed genetically, evolutionarily, to go after food. So what does it mean if a rat chooses food over cocaine? Does it mean that the food is more addictive? It's more complicated than that. The FDA relies on so many tests to figure out whether something is likely to become addictive or not. Condition-place preference is just one of the easiest tests, and so it's usually one of the first ones to be used. And full disclaimer here, there was another part to the study where they actually looked at the activation of brain cells to both cocaine and food. This was a direct comparison, and food activated more cells than cocaine in an area that we know processes reward. But we're still trying to figure out what these cells actually do. We know they're involved in reward processing, but we don't know that their activation is gonna lead to addiction. One simple study asking what rats like shouldn't have taken off in the media like it did. Science never looks at one study as showing truth. It's when many studies using different tests all point to the same conclusion that we should start to think something might be up. We want to use science as a tool to help us make decisions. What we can do to live happier, healthier, more fulfilling lives. When the media grabs a hold of a small piece of scientific evidence and runs with it instead of seeing it for what it is, it harms us all. When a story saying the opposite comes out a month later, we feel cheated, like science is leading us astray and can't be trusted. This problem is at all levels. The scientists who did the Oreos study weren't clear about the limitations of their study, and it could have been lost in translation. We don't really know. The study hasn't been published yet. I really believe that it's scientists' jobs to talk about what it is that they do, to be part of the scientific conversation around issues. I also believe it's the media's job to focus more on the nuances of science instead of just the sensationalism, especially when it's not warranted. And I believe it's your job to stay skeptical, yet curious. So what does science tell us about Oreos and addiction? The jury's still out, but I wouldn't worry about eating an Oreo just yet. Oh my gosh. Almost better than cocaine. Maybe this thing is wrong. Asking my aluminum bill and an injury. Ah, crap. Eating an entire family-sized so simple. Because I'm totally recording right now.
Hi, can I have an Oreo?
No, don't eat it. Don't eat it. Don't eat it. It's been in the...
Oh.
You have a whole pile of hamburgers. I want to eat a little shot of cocaine. Hamburgers. I mean, really.
Is it filming?
I mean, yeah. You are in the movie. Yay, research. It's a wrap. So that's my first video. I hope you guys have some interesting comments and suggestions, some topics maybe that we could talk about in the future. And the reason I wanted to really start this was to have a conversation with you about science. I mean, science belongs to everyone, not just the scientists. So check out my future links. Also, everything I said in this episode is also in John Oliver's thing about science reporting. And I'm telling you, it is, as a scientist coming from the inside, he is dead on. So I highly suggest you watch that video. It's very, very good. Otherwise, click some interesting links and things.